Hello everybody, welcome to this video. It's a bit of an unusual one for me today because usually I'd maybe make a written piece about this, but I thought a video would reach more people on this subject because I think it's something worth talking about, worth exploring. So yeah, we're in the garage today. This is my PCR TSV 100 for those that are interested in those sort of things. We've got an L2 IBA carb for the geeks out there. I thought she'd join us today because I love this girl and I want her to be here. Okay, I just wanted to say that, I don't know. But I thought I'd explore the subject of Lewis Hamilton's comments recently on the Graham Norton show. I think he said these comments before about karting, motorsport in general, but he referenced karting become prohibitively expensive for people on a lower income background, and he feels that someone from a lower income background today wouldn't be able to make it to F1. And then he had friends that had been leapfrogged by wealthier drivers, and that he feels like he wants to do some work with the FIA to address this problem. I think fundamentally what he's saying is true. I think, someone coming from a low income background today would really struggle to do karting and then even dream of going and do a Formula Renault or Formula 4, whatever it is nowadays. But the first thing I wanted to say was it was extremely unlikely from someone from a lower income background back when Lewis raced karts to make it to F1. I think one of the things that was unique about Lewis, because I raced at the same time as Lewis. I was doing the club circuit, and a few times I'd say I raced Lewis, but we were on the circuit at the same time. I wasn't anywhere near him and the top guys, but it was unlikely for him to make it back then. I think how he got to F1 is a remarkable story, and there was some we have to explain Lewis's story to then go into detail about the ramifications of what he said and stuff like that, and how that might affect karting. So Lewis was racing cadets in Britain in the mid 90s, 95, 96. I think he started in 94. I started in 95. And at the time, he won the British Championship at Super 1, and then you also had Champions of the Future, which was a championship that was broadcast on ITV, prime time. So for the first time, karting, and this was more specific to junior karting, was getting a massive amount of attention from the mainstream media outlets. So Lewis's career has been documented from kind of day one to when he reached F1. So you had Champions of the Future, which was giving a massive amount of exposure to these young drivers. It was sponsored by Mercedes. I can't remember if it was McLaren Mercedes or just Mercedes. I think it was McLaren Mercedes. So you already straight away had a relationship with an F1 team. I think Ron Dennis was there giving out trophies now and again. So Lewis's career at that point was fantastic. He was the best driver in the country. For that age group, I don't think it wasn't until I saw Max Verstappen race karts that I thought I was watching someone of Lewis's talent again. But he had that exposure, and at the time it was still kind of a new thing, like this idea of someone being spotted in karts and then being taken and funded all the way to F1. It was still kind of a new thing back then. It was unheard of. So the opportunity for someone like Lewis, and let's not forget Martin Hines was around back then, and he was supporting young drivers. So, you had Martin Hines, you had a really hard-working father who was doing everything he could to get Lewis racing, and you had Champions of the Future and a relationship with an F1 team. So, for Lewis, everything happened at the right time. I think even back then it was unlikely for someone like Lewis to get to F1. It was still, it's unlikely. It's very unlikely today, but it was unlikely back then. So I think it's worth noting that Lewis's success should be lauded a bit more, because I don't think we can go, back then it was easier, because in some ways, karting back then, you had qualifiers for the British Championship and everything like that, which I failed to qualify for. I did try. So the sport was really tough back then. So I think in one way we should celebrate, Lewis's success, but also look at it upon caution, because even back then it was unlikely. So we forward winded today, and suddenly karting. You know, the karts fundamentally, say cadet karts, haven't really changed. They're still 60cc air-cooled karts. You know, the chassis are the same. The actual mechanics of the sport haven't changed all that much. What has changed is the perception of karting, especially juniors and cadets. Back then, even though people were doing karting with the dream of being an F1 driver, it wasn't as documented as it is now. You know, because Lewis's career from being a karter is now all over YouTube. You can go in and say, Lewis started in cadet karts at these circuits and he got to F1. So what that does is, in today's environment, is it creates a perception that you have to do karting, you have to win in karting. So you increase the demand for karting wins and karting titles and to be noticed in karting. And when you increase this demand and you don't increase the supply, there's only one thing that can happen: costs go up. So the first point that I wanted to make was, it's kind of a paradox in a sense, or catch-22. If you're concerned that karting costs are becoming too expensive, you have to address why they're becoming too expensive. And one of the main drivers is people have exploited Lewis's success, and you know, you might have Super 1 to F1 was a tag. All of these champions, you know, chips will always cite, you know, start here. This is where Lewis started. Even when Champions of the Futures kind of developed into Formula Kart stars years later, Lewis's image was right at the top of it. So this isn't Lewis's fault. This is people using Lewis's image to sell their championship and to get drivers to do it, and then the teams do the same thing. You know, so if you're saying to drivers and parents, you must do this if you want to be an F1 driver, there's only one way, only one sort of route that costs are going to go, and that's upwards. So this relationship with F1 for karting, especially sort of the junior ranks, has been, in my view, a disaster. I think we, as a sport, shouldn't have got into bed with this kind of marketing talk. I think karting itself has been exploited, and we've allowed ourselves to be subservient to F1 and car racing. And if we're being subservient to car racing and being where all the young drivers are nurtured, you can't be surprised that then suddenly the big money sort of comes flying in. Because if you've got a few multi-millionaires, I'm not nothing against multi-millionaires, I'm just talking about the function of the market, being told, you know, come and do this, you drive, your son or your daughter will get loads of attention and you'll make it to F1, then suddenly you're justifying the spend. You know, the spend is only going to go up. They're going to invest the money because you have to do it. So the first thing that karting needs to do, and anyone that's interested in maybe reducing the cost of karting, is divorce itself with the relationship with F1. It's been a complete disaster in my view that championships, because they've had to do it because they needed to chase the entries. You know, it's easier to say do this because you want to do F1 than do this because karting is brilliant. You might want to be the top kart. The concept of being the top karter in the country is something alien to people, you know. So if we make the sport about F1, you can't be shocked that the costs go up. So the first thing I'd say about Lewis's point was, yes, costs are prohibitive in some areas. At the same time, Lewis's image, and it's not just Lewis, it's the whole of the sport. Maybe in France they might use a particular driver. In Germany they'll use Vettel and Schumacher. But we have to divorce ourselves from that as a sport. I think motocross is kind of motocross has its cost problems as well. Let's not get wrong, but that's a sport where the relationship's a bit healthier. Like some riders start in motocross and then go on to the sort of the road racing and circuit racing scene. But motocross still maintains its identity, you know, and it creates its own professionals, and it's its own environment, it's its own sort of thing. Whereas karting, we are essentially the same, but we've sold out ourselves to F1 with this kind of misconception that any of those people give a toss about karting. They don't give a monkeys about the health of karting. I think Lewis does, but in general, F1 people don't care about the health of karting. So I think we should be very careful about their influence on the sport. If we are to explore, maybe. So that's my first point. If you want to, it's hard because costs are such an abstract thing to get down because the fundamentals of the actual mechanics of sport haven't changed all that much. So okay, to make a quick point, if I wanted to race this car and this was the British Championship car at the time, it would be quite expensive. But 25 years later, I don't have to spend so much money on exactly the same equipment because there's not the pressure to win because the consequences of a career going up in smoke isn't there. So costs are kind of an abstract thing. So when we say costs are too high, we have to look at what is pushing the costs up. And I think the costs have been pushed up because people think F1. They think Lewis Hamilton. So first of all, yes, I think Lewis is right. But at the same point, we have to acknowledge Lewis's image, and it's not his fault at all. But people have exploited his image to sell those high prices. If I was to maybe say humour this idea that the FIA could help in any way, that Lewis wants to speak to the FIA, we could look at maybe the FIA Academy Trophy, which is the FIA's kind of own one-make series where they supply the karts and engines, and drivers from each countries are then nominated to compete, right? And I think it's relatively fixed cost and so on, right? So it sort of eradicates this sort of people coming in, spending big, buying engines and so on. My belief that sort of racing doesn't necessarily decrease costs because the selling point is still F1. Make a career out of motorsport, F1. And I'll give you an example why I don't think it would reduce costs. I was at PF and there was a young driver there who was testing in the next bay. It was quite a quiet day, and he was racing in the Academy Trophy. I won't name who it was. And he was there with a well-known karting figure who runs a team. And let's see what he had. He had 2 karts, 2 OK Junior karts. And so he had to run 2 Junior OK karts that he was probably hiring. His dad wasn't there, which is I find it extraordinary with other sport where the parents just leave their kids at the track, and to me it's what's the point of doing it? But anyway, that's beside the point. So he had 2 karts. He had a top British driver there as a sort of driver coach to go out on the track with him, and he had a mechanic running the 2 karts. He might have had 2 mechanics. So let's tot up the cost for this one test day for someone in the Academy Trophy with a fixed cost. He had 2 karts rental. Let's say we do this on the cheap, right? So you say kart rental £300 each for the day, right? That you can't even get an X30 for that. But let's go as if you wanted to do this on the cheap. So kart rental is 300, so that's 600 quid. He halfway through the day put on new tyres. So that's 2 sets of new tyres and 2 sets of used tyres. So that's 300. Let's say 400. So we'll put 1,000 quid. You've got to hire the coach and the driver. So that's maybe another 200 quid. We'll put 1,200 quid. Then you've got to hire the mechanic. So we're now 1,450. Then you've got to have the team guy there running the show. So we're up at 1,500 quid for a test day. For someone who's competing in a single make controlled arrive and drive series. So the point being here that if you're selling the F1 dream, costs are always going to go crazy. You need to divorce yourself from F1. Get F1 out of the picture if you want costs to somehow be reduced, because costs are high in my view because the demand for these championships is so high. Okay, as an additional point as well to address to Lewis's problem about working class or low income families is the FIA have introduced a super license system that means drivers have to accrue points in various car series to get enough license points to compete in F1. It's like the Max Verstappen law, because I don't want that to happen again. The problem with this is, again, it's supply and demand. If you're saying that you need to accrue these points, you increase the demand for results in various car series. If you increase the demand and you don't increase the supply, costs will go up. You know, teams will... And there is super license points in karting as well. So if you're saying to people, you need X amount of points, right, and you've got to do this car series to get them and win, you're just giving teams a license to print money, because they're saying, we've got the best car, we're the team that's going to win, this is what you need to get into F1 because you need the points. Bam, £1.5 million a year, £2 million a year. So that's separate to karting, but I thought I'd just throw that in there. So the sport is constructed in a way now that is really discriminates people from a low-income background, because you can't do a year in cars and get into F1, you know, like Max Verstappen or Kimi Raikkonen. But again, I think fundamentally you can't fix karting if you're coming from an F1 perspective, because if you're selling karting as a route to F1, it's gonna push costs up no matter what. You know, like the example with the academy driver, the money will be spent because you have to win. F1 teams, it's not like F1 teams are hiring drivers at the same rate they used to anyway. I mean, you know, one particular driver's father's bought a team, so the structure of the team, you know, F1 isn't motorsport isn't a meritocracy anyway. So, yeah, I think to conclude, you can't look at karting and say it's broken and then fix it with F1 in mind. The best way to maybe reduce the pressure on costs is for karting to actively, as a sport, as a collective, and everybody's complicit in this because we've all done it, whether we're in media or with championships, we need to divorce ourselves from this relationship. It's a toxic relationship we have with car racing. We have some of the best drivers in the world racing karts and in Britain, and we don't celebrate them. All we do is evangelise and worship drivers in F1. You know, for me, I go to a club. I was at Shannington the other week, and Danny Cole was there. Right, Danny Cole's 2017 world champion. He's the British champion in X30, even though I don't like the idea of a single mate championship having British championship status, but here we are. And in any other sport where a guy that's a world champion is in the paddock, he'd be being swamped by the young drivers, you know, wanting to get an autograph or a photo, and he's just there and he's doing his thing, you know, and no one cares. But if Lance Stroll or who else came into the paddock, everyone would be wanting autographs and all this kind of stuff. And to me, that's why karting is broken. We don't focus on karting. We're looking at F1. We're looking at people outside. You know, to me, there's the fundamental issue. That's why there's an upward pressure on costs, because we worship F1, and as long as we do that, costs are going to be high because wealthier people are going to just pile into it and keep spending money because you have to get attention, even though the attention you get is meaningless, because it's not like, you know, Mercedes F1 are going to a kart meet and then going, bang, here's 100 grand to fund drivers anymore. Maybe they are, but, you know, a lot of these young driver programs are being paid for by the drivers. So, yes, I think I'm rambling on now. You know, if you're still with me, thank you. But I think my fundamental point is you can't fix karting from an F1 perspective. The only way karting can fix itself with regard to costs is divorcing itself from its relationship and its dependency on F1. We have to be much better at promoting ourselves. We have to be much better at selling karting as a sport on its own, and celebrating the drivers that are successful in karting and making karting sustainable without this heroin-like dependency on F1 and car racing to promote itself. You know, and if we allow ourselves to be exploited by F1 to find talent, karting will get neutered. You know, it will. The only way you can really feasibly do it is you kill off manufacturer racing, you kill off, you know, even though it's pretty much dead anyway, but you kill all that off and you make it arrive and drive, and you be subservient to what car racing teams and car racing regulators want. Well, I need to reject that as a sport. I don't know how, you know, because everybody in karting, I mean, even that, you know, our GMMC is doing a new series called Champions of the Future. You know, it's the champions of now we should be concerned with. And if we concern ourselves with the sport, we don't concern ourselves with what F1 people think, then we might have a hope in a future for the sport. You know. But yeah, I'm repeating myself now. But yeah, thank you for watching. I think Lewis's intentions are good. I think he knows the sport very well. But to an extent, we have to acknowledge that his image, and this isn't his fault, his image has been exploited to allow karting costs to rise. It's not his responsibility, but I think we have to say that if we're looking to F1 to fix karting, it ain't going to happen. They don't care, you know. They don't care about us. I'm not saying Lewis does, I'm talking about F1 in general. So thank you for watching. If you've got a comment, please leave one below the video. Also, there's links to our Patreon below this video as well. So if you want to help keep the channel running, feel free to sign up. You know, $1 a month, every little penny sort of helps or cent. So yes, thank you for watching, and yeah, keep karting.